Get ready for the unknown. If you love feeling the chill down your spine and venturing into stories that will take your sleep away, subscribe to our channel now and activate the bell. Don't miss the next horror tales that will take you to the darkest corners of your mind. Are you ready to face your fears? Portal is open. Enter. For a moment, Carlos thought he was going mad. He began to hear the distant sound of a woman crying, faintly like an echo coming from the sea. His heart raced and he picked up his pace, heading towards the sound. It was then that he saw her again. The bride was standing still, closer to the water this time, staring at the waves, as if waiting for someone to emerge from the sea. "Do you need help?" Carlos asked, his voice trembling. The woman didn't answer, just turned slowly to face him. Her eyes were even sadder than before, as if they carried an ancient, deep, and irremediable pain. She took a step towards him, and Carlos felt a biting cold invade his body, so intense that he could barely move. "He's coming. Have you seen him?" she murmured, almost inaudibly. Carlos took a step back, startled, not knowing what to do. Who's coming?" He tried to insist, but his fiancée just shook her head, looking out to sea again. The crying came again, and before Charles could get any closer, she disappeared back into the mist, like a mirage that is blown away by the wind. The silence that followed was overwhelming, and Carlos felt a wave of panic wash over him. He ran back to the city, convinced that something much bigger was going on. He needed to find out who the groom was, and why the spirit of that bride was trapped, wandering the beach. But as he tried to find answers, Carlos realized that he was getting close to something dangerous, something that perhaps shouldn't be dug up. Over the next few days, Carlos immersed himself in research into the history of the Bride of Copacabana. He visited libraries, read old newspapers, and spoke to older residents of the area. It was in a newspaper report from 1987 that he found what he was looking for. The bride's name was Clara Mendonça, a young woman who died tragically in a car accident on the way to her wedding. The groom, Eduardo, never got married, and little was known about what had happened to him after the tragedy. The more Carlos found out, the more he felt that Clara and Eduardo's story was far from being a simple accident. There were rumors that Clara's death was not a mere accident, but something planned. Some said that Eduardo had been involved with dangerous people, and that Clara had paid the price for it. The question that haunted Carlos now was, why was Clara's spirit still trapped there, on the Copacabana waterfront? That night, while digging through more files, Carlos received an anonymous message with a single sentence. He never reached her. Feeling more disturbed than ever, Carlos began to realize that something much darker was behind this story. He began to have nightmares about his fiancée, seeing her coming closer and closer, as if she were calling him closer to the sea. In his dreams, he heard Clara's screams, but he also heard another voice, a male voice, whispering secrets that he couldn't fully understand. The nightmares became so intense that Carlos could hardly sleep. He felt that his fiancée was pulling him into her tragedy. After all, what did Clara want from him? And who was the him she had been waiting for? Carlos began to feel that the answers he was looking for lay beyond the world of the living. With his mind increasingly disturbed, Carlos decided that he needed to find Eduardo, his missing fiancé. Perhaps he was the key to freeing Clara's spirit and finally putting an end to the torment she was spreading on the beach. Carlos followed the few clues he had about Eduardo, the man who had disappeared after Clara's death. No one knew for sure what had happened to him. Some believed he had fled abroad, unable to bear the pain, while others believed he had been killed by people involved with his family. After weeks of searching, Carlos found a reference to a man living in isolation in a small town in the interior of Rio de Janeiro. Determined, Carlos traveled to the town and upon arriving discovered an elderly man living in a remote hut. It was Eduardo, the groom who had never managed to get married. Eduardo was broken, consumed by years of guilt and remorse. When Carlos mentioned Clara, the old man burst into tears. "She's still there, isn't she?" he asked, his voice breaking. Eduardo confessed that he had never had the courage to go to the place where Clara died. Something stopped him, something much more powerful than fear. Eduardo revealed that Clara died because he had made a deal. a desperate pact, in the hope of saving his family from debts to dangerous people. But the pact took a toll he never imagined, the life of his fiancée. "I didn't know she would be the victim," he said, his eyes full of regret. "I didn't know they were using her to punish me." Clara, without knowing it, was the bargaining chip in a macabre game, and her spirit would never find peace as long as she waited for a fiancé who could never come. Carlos then understood that Clara's spirit wasn't simply wandering out of love or sadness. She was trapped in that cycle of mourning, believing that Eduardo was still around, that he would come to save her. Eduardo never was, and Carlos knew that Clara's spirit would only rest if she discovered the truth. The problem was how to tell a spirit that his life had been a cruel bargain. Eduardo gave Carlos an object that he had kept since the day of the accident, Clara's veil. It was the only link that still connected him to her. Carlos now had the most difficult mission, to confront Clara's spirit with the truth. Back in Copacabana, Carlos knew he had to finish it. He returned to the beach with Clara's veil in hand, determined to face the spirit one last time. The night was darker than usual, and the sound of the waves seemed louder, more threatening. The few people passing by barely noticed his presence, except for one thing. Carlos' eyes were fixed on the sea, where he knew his fiancée would appear. Suddenly, Clara's figure emerged from the mist once again. Her lost gaze met Carlos's. But this time he was ready. Holding the veil in his hands, Carlos approached slowly, feeling the chill emanating from her intensify with every step. "I know what happened to you, Clara," he said, his voice firm. She stopped, her eyes fixed on the veil. Carlos told her the truth. The whole story of Edward's pact, of the involuntary sacrifice that took her. Clara's tears began to flow more forcefully, and her expression of sadness turned to intense pain. "He'll never come for me," she murmured, as the wind grew stronger around her. The veil in Carlos's hands began to shake violently, and he felt a wave of powerful energy pass through him. Clara, now understanding her destiny, looked at the veil one last time before letting out a soul-crushing scream. With one last breath, Clara's spirit dissipated into thin air, and the veil fell gently to the sand. The sea, which had been roaring furiously before, calmed down, as if it were following the bride's departure. Charles stood there, alone in the darkness, feeling the sadness of parting, but also the relief of knowing that Clara had finally found the peace she had been searching for. The legend of the Bride of Copacabana had come to an end, but Carlos knew he would never forget the experience. And although Clara's spirit was finally free, her memories would continue to haunt those who walked along the beach at night, like a silent shadow on the waves. Months had passed since Carlos released the spirit of Clara, the Bride of Copacabana. The legend seemed to have been buried along with the memories of the tragedy, and the beach resumed its usual calm. But those who walked along the shore at night still felt something different in the air. A sense of invisible observation that left a chill down their backs. It was then that new events began to emerge. Laura, a young photographer, moved to Copacabana in search of inspiration for a personal project. She loved the beach's nocturnal landscapes and often captured them with her camera, but she noticed something strange in her photos. In some of them, inexplicable shadows appeared on the horizon, indistinct figures as if someone was watching from afar. She didn't take much notice at first, thinking they were just lighting faults. However, on a particularly cold night, something suddenly made her stop, the soft sound of a child's laughter coming from somewhere near the sea. Laura stopped and looked around, but the beach was empty. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a chill that wasn't caused by the wind. The sound repeated, this time closer, and Laura felt her body freeze. Grabbing her camera, she started photographing compulsively, trying to capture any movement her eyes couldn't see. That's when she saw it. A small child's silhouette playing by the shore, tiny hands drawing something in the sand. She called out, but the figure didn't respond. As she approached, the child vanished. Laura's heart raced. It was as if the beach was trying to reveal something she couldn't understand, but the sensation that she was being lured by something invisible terrified her. The next morning, when she looked at the photos she had taken, her stomach turned. In one of them, the child was clearly visible, but its face was blurred, as if being swallowed by shadows. Behind it, a larger, vaguely human figure emerged. While Laura tried to make sense of what she had seen that night, a new character entered the story. Raphael, an experienced surfer who spent his mornings on the beach. Raphael had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but Laura's recent experiences piqued his curiosity. The two met by chance when Laura, still disturbed by her photos, bumped into Raphael as he was leaving the water. Intrigued by Laura's insistence that something strange was happening, Raphael decided to join her on one of her late-night photography sessions. "We'll prove there's nothing there," he said with a confident smile. But that night, the beach felt different. The mist that usually lingered over the sea crept onto the sand, covering the place with a thin, opaque layer. Laura started photographing again, but Raphael, watching the horizon, felt something odd. Suddenly, he saw the same figure Laura had described, a child running towards the waves. But something was wrong. The child ran in circles, as if trapped in a repetitive cycle. Raphael tried to approach, but as he got closer, the air grew colder, and the sound of the ocean began to fade, as if he were being sucked into another dimension. "Do you see this?" he asked, but Laura, distracted by her camera, hadn't noticed the change in the atmosphere. When Raphael took one more step towards the child, it stopped abruptly, and a new figure emerged from the mist. A tall woman, dressed in white, with a veil covering her face. Raphael felt a chill run down his spine, and, unable to move, he watched as the woman's figure slowly approached. When she lifted the veil, her eyes were empty, but filled with a sadness he had never seen before. At that moment, Raphael knew they were dealing with something far greater than they had expected. In the days that followed, Laura and Raphael began to unravel the mystery together. They discovered that since Clara's death, not only had her spirit roamed the beach, but others had started to appear as well. It seemed that Clara's release had caused a rupture, a breach between the world of the living and the dead. The shadows Laura saw in her photos and the child Raphael had spotted were echoes of souls now trapped there, lost in a cycle of suffering and pain. On a silent night, Laura had a disturbing dream. She was on the beach, alone, and saw Clara in the distance. The bride waved to her, as if she wanted to show her something important. Laura followed her, and Clara led her to the bottom of the sea, where the water became darker and colder. At the bottom, she saw several children, their faces covered in sand, as if they were trapped. "They are still here," Clara said, her voice echoing as if coming from the depths. Laura woke up with a scream, convinced that Clara's spirit still had a role in the story. Raphael also began having visions of Clara during his surfing sessions. He saw her in the water, floating just below the surface, her long hair moving like seaweed. Every time he tried to ignore her, she appeared closer. When he tried to talk to Laura about it, the two realized that Clara was trying to guide them to something bigger, something still hidden in the beach's history. It was as if Copacabana Beach was alive, a place where the dead couldn't find rest, but also where the living could lose themselves. Raphael began to wonder if Clara had really been set free, or if her presence had simply attracted other souls who were also seeking help. Determined to follow the clues left by Clara, Laura and Raphael delved deeper into the old stories of Copacabana. They discovered that decades ago, the beach had been the scene of several tragic deaths, many involving children who mysteriously disappeared. The records were vague, but some reports spoke of inexplicable drownings, and the victims' bodies were never found. Feeling that they were close to uncovering the truth, the two decided to conduct one final investigation on the beach, this time at the exact spot where Clara always appeared. When they arrived, the fog seemed thicker than ever, and the crashing of the waves sounded deeper, almost like a lament. As Laura prepared to take photos, Raphael once again heard the sound of a child's laughter, and this time, he knew he wasn't imagining it. As they approached the water, a terrifying scene unfolded before them. The figures of the children began emerging from the waves, their clothes drenched and their eyes lifeless. They looked at Raphael and Laura with expressions of desperation, reaching out their hands as if asking for help. Among them, Clara appeared again, but this time, her expression was one of warning. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a weak voice. "There's something deeper, something they haven't let rest yet." Laura felt panic rising inside her, But before they could react, the waves retreated violently, revealing what appeared to be a submerged structure, an ancient stone altar. There, in the depths, lay the true secret of the beach, a long-forgotten ritual involving sacrifices. The children who had disappeared weren't lost by accident. They had been offered as part of a dark pact, a cycle of death that kept the souls trapped. Laura and Raphael, shocked by what they had discovered, knew that the submerged altar was the key to freeing the trapped souls on the beach. Clara had been the first victim, but the children who disappeared were part of a much larger and older cycle. Copacabana Beach was more than just a tourist destination. It was the site of an ancient sacrifice that continued to claim lives, drawing in those who got lost in its waves. Determined to break the cycle, Raphael dove toward the altar while Laura stayed at the surface, trying to fend off the shadows that appeared around them. The sea seemed to come alive, trying to swallow Raphael before he could reach the altar. The figures of the children drew closer, their faces now clearly visible, pleading for salvation. Clara, her eyes filled with tears, whispered one final request: "End this." When Raphael reached the altar, he found something surprising. Clara's veil, caught between the stones, still soaked and heavy. As he removed the veil and cast it to the surface, a wave of energy rippled through the sea. The shadows began to dissipate, and the children, including Clara, slowly vanished, as if finally being set free. That night, Copacabana Beach returned to its quiet state. Laura and Raphael knew they had ended a cycle, but the feeling that the waves still held secrets left them uneasy. Copacabana would never be just a beach to them. It was a place where past and present met, where the living could, at any moment, cross paths with the dead.